Good afternoon. My name is Ute Poiger, and I'm the Dean of the College of Social Sciences and Humanities. It's a great pleasure to welcome all of you this afternoon to our 7th annual and 2nd virtual CSSH Undergraduate Research Forum. And it is indeed the 2nd time that we are together virtually. It's such a pleasure to see presenters, to see moderators, to see guests here for this afternoon's session. And I right away want to remind all of us that we are very excited about what we are hearing this afternoon, but that you all will also have an opportunity to hear the second part of the Undergraduate Research Forum next week as well. And I know Laura Green will say more about that at the end of this session. For now, we want to focus on the very exciting research that undergraduate students have done in the context of the majors and minors, many of them also combined majors in CSSH. And I'm so impressed again by the range of difficult and interesting and important topics that you all are tackling. Questions that address issues of culture, of community, of crime and politics, questions that are so important for today's world, a world in which we see, I think, so much divisiveness, so much uncertainty, and in a world in which we need to constantly work for change, and at the same time, of course, have had so many individual as well as broader challenges over the last year as well. And so it's a real privilege to be here for the 2nd time in this virtual environment. What this allows us to do as well is say hello to admitted students to Northeastern. And again, I hope that our conversations today give you a sense of the exciting work that we are doing in the context of the experiential liberal arts, work that always focuses on ways of thinking about how we engage with communities beyond the universities, be it locally, be it globally, and work that also always thinks about how to use different methodologies in order to get at big questions of past, present, and to imagine a better future as well. It's a real pleasure then to turn the microphone and the screen over to the moderator of our first panel, our colleague Patricia Davis, who is a professor in communication studies and also an affiliate professor in the College of Social Sciences and Humanities. Thank you so much, Professor Davis, for joining us today and for moderating this first panel.
You're welcome. Thank you, Dean Poiger. Our first speaker on panel 1 will be Ava Gallo, Environmental Studies and International Affairs.
Share my screen. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Ava Gallo, and I am a 5th-year Environmental Studies and International Affairs major with a minor in Law and Public Policy. And my project is entitled Centering Community Voice in the Build Back Better Conversation. So the story begins of my research project with my co-op at Climate Exchange, which started in August 2020, which I started first as a co-op student and continued on working full-time into the spring semester. Climate Exchange is a climate nonprofit organization working to advance climate legislation at a state level. When I joined the organization, the research team was just putting out—
Can I just ask you to slow down just a little bit? As you can see, we have interpreters and will just help everybody, and you are doing such important work. We want to fully take it in, all of us. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. So when I joined the organization, the research team was just putting out a Build Back Better report for Washington State, quantifying the job creation and public health benefits associated with investing stimulus funds into various climate projects. And we're preparing to start another project for Massachusetts. Knowing the historical exclusion of vulnerable population from stimulus programs and the disproportionate impact of both climate change and the pandemic on vulnerable communities, I knew it would be important to emphasize community priorities in tandem with the release of the quantitative report from Climate Exchange, and thus this project was born. In order to truly advance the ideas of environmental justice and participatory action research, we partnered with a community development corporation in the Boston area, Fairmount Indigo CDC Collaborative, into the design, implementation, and analysis phases of this project. To gather community priorities, we wanted to hear from organizations across the Commonwealth who could speak to the issues that their communities were facing and how best to solve them. We conducted semi-structured interviews with 30 participants, ranging from representatives from community organizations, community development corporations, community colleges, and unions. We asked about the immediate and long-term problems facing their communities, how stimulus spending would best be spent to address these issues, what climate projects should receive any immediate funding, and how stimulus spending can be made most accessible to the members of their communities. To value the time of each participant, each interviewee was offered a $50 stipend for a personal compensation or as a donation to their organization. After all the interviews were completed, we transcribed them and uploaded them to a coding software, Deduce, to systematically analyze for recurring themes. But one overall idea emerged in almost every interview, best reflected in the next quote from one of our interview participants. And there is also this disconnect between climate and community and emergency needs. So we've been working to kind of respect that emergency needs precede climate conversations at time, because folks are trying to stay at home, provide food for their family, provide the essential childcare and services. So to make sure we're considering how we prioritize those before we can move to a place where they can see past a year from now, 10 years from now. When we started off each interview asking about the immediate needs of a community, their answers were usually the same: food insecurity, housing stability, unemployment, and the immediate effects of the pandemic. And it was usually only when we asked specifically about climate projects that projects like microgrids or electric vehicle infrastructure emerged. Essentially, what this interviewee describes is that people are struggling, and people were struggling even before the pandemic exacerbated those stressors. It is evident that vulnerable populations will suffer the most from the impacts of climate change. So it is vital to make bold moves to address carbon emissions. However, it is equally, if not more important, to address the urgent needs of communities in Massachusetts right now. Stimulus funding needs to accomplish both concurrently. Within this overall thesis came many more specific themes, some which are represented in this slide. Analysis phase is still in progress for this research project, but many of these ideas have already emerged from various transcripts of the interviews. In the interest of time, I will dive in deeper into the barriers to benefits category, which is in the first section. This section identifies obstacles for people in receiving not only benefits from stimulus spending, but also obstacles in achieving social mobility and economic prosperity in general. First, access to childcare and elder care emerge as a way to increase a person's ability to return to the workforce. The pandemic has only increased stressors to this barrier because of remote learning. How are people are expected to go back to the workforce and increase their economic prosperity if they're unable to find someone to care for their children who are doing remote learning? Additionally, access to higher education is also vital to a young person's social mobility, and there have been many examples brought up of successful green job training programs through these institutions that we've talked to. Stimulus spending could go to enhancing these opportunities and also providing additional scholarships to increase access to all. Additionally, a barrier to receiving benefits from climate projects is the lack of upfront capital. Many interviewees noted the potential benefits of solar panels to decrease utility costs for vulnerable populations and the ability of electric vehicles to reduce pollution in environmentally burdened neighborhoods. However, these technologies are often with very high costs, barring low-income communities from receiving these benefits they so desperately need. And finally, communities with language barriers struggles to know how to access stimulus funding or other resources. And so it is important that public outreach is conducted in many different languages to increase accessibility. And that is just one of the larger themes that emerged from our conversations with community representatives. The final product of this project will be a report published by Climate Exchange and Fairmount Indigo's CDC Collaborative. However, each interviewee was also asked how best this research could help their organizational priorities and what inputs would best disseminate the results to their communities to ensure that the information gathered is beneficial to the participants who provided the information for the report, a central tenet of participatory action research. Shorter form pieces, including graphics and articles, will be published in various different languages as requested by the participants, and our work will be presented back to the communities of the interviewees at several different venues. I am excited to bring the voices of community across the Commonwealth together with Climate Exchange's technical data to ensure that our state legislators have the best information to decide how to allocate the imminent stimulus spending. So thank you so much for your time, and I will appreciate any questions that come from the panel.
Thank you. Our next group for panel 1 will be Linda Manziaris, Science and Finance.
Hello. Sorry, I'm having an issue with. Hello, so my name is Matthew Greer-Gentis. I'm a junior majoring in finance and government, and my research partner, Linda, is a senior majoring in criminology and political science. And our research project is on the systemic criminogenic risk factors and their effect on deported veterans. So we're gonna overall be going through a presentation, the concept of an opportunity, approach, impact, and solution. And yeah, so we're both really excited to speak today. So opportunity. So a lot of Americans aren't aware that non-citizens can serve in our military, and they have a major service to our military facets. Between 2013 and 2018, 44,000 non-citizens joined the US military and serve as active soldiers in every branch. Many have been decorated for their service, yet the government regularly deports non-citizen veterans. Deported non-citizen veterans are predominantly Latinx, holding citizenship from a Latin country. When removed, they are customarily deported to Mexican border cities, specifically Tijuana, the busiest land border crossing in the world. Deported veterans are exposed to a variety of criminogenic risk factors. Veterans are forced to leave their families in the US, lose access to resources provided by Veterans Affairs, and are victims of Mexico's narco-kleptocracy. Failure to minimize and control risk factors that affect deported veterans systematically promotes involvement in gang and cartel violence, continued substance abuse, and increased suicide rates.
Matthew, can I ask you to slow down a little bit?
Oh, of course.
It will allow all of us to take everything in fully. Thank you.
Thank you. So the best solution to address the deported veteran crisis is for the United States Congress to pass federally binding legislation. Congress should reintroduce the House Resolution 1078, Repatriate Our Patriots Act, to House Judiciary Committee in the 117th Congress, because only an act in this manner would recognize the injustice of deporting American veterans and allowing the members of this community legal status in the United States. So for our research project, I'm originally from San Diego, California. And from this experience, I've been volunteering at a deported veteran support house located in Tijuana, Mexico. And so it's actually been the best situation right now to conduct research because Southern California has the largest veteran community in the United States. And Tijuana is a primary port for deportation of immigration and customs enforcement. And because Tijuana contains the largest concentration of deported veterans where the criminogenic risk factors are prevalent, we were able to use our ethnographic research to make some conclusions. And so this was actually really beneficial because through our research method, we realized that a lot of the quantitative sources on deported veterans were very misleading. The main source on deported veterans today is the limited skewed data that ICE has reported, as they have only reported 92 veteran deportations in the last 20 years. However, a support house has directly worked with 450 veterans living in Tijuana alone. And to an even larger extremity is the US Congressional Hispanic Caucus, which estimates 3,000 cases of deportations across Mexican border cities. So in this, Linda and I used the ethnographic research from my time at the bunker, and we used external studies such as the ACLU, Gallo, and public data such as the San Diego courthouses, San Diego court records, FBI database, and Veterans Affairs.
So with my background in criminology, we analyzed the data, we analyzed our findings through this this lens. And what we found is that there's three main criminogenic risk factors which compound on each other and create a situation where veterans have higher rates of suicide, have involvement in gangs and cartels, and face continued substance abuse problems. So that all, when each of these risk factors, general strain theory, social disorganization, and NME, when they all combine, they fall under the dynamic cascade theory of criminology, in that they sort of compound on each other and can interreact with each other. So first theory that we relied on is the community element under general strain theory, and general strain theory being that sort of a basic definition of it being that criminal behavior is an adaptation to stress or strains. Among the strains can encourage an individual's criminal behavior by removing positive stimuli and the introduction of negative stimuli. So what we found is that when these veterans are deported, the deportation process in itself can be it can cause a lot of strain, in that veterans go straight from the deportation facility to the border. They have no opportunity to collect their items. With interviews with the person who runs the Deported Veteran Safe House in Tijuana, he indicated that some of the immediate struggles facing veterans are that they're homeless, they don't have access to any food right away, and a lot of them fall back into substance abuse issues as soon as they're deported because of the amount of stress and strain that they are introduced to. Additionally, they lose access to seeing their families. Most of the veterans have spent extensive periods of time, 10, 20 plus years in the United States. And when they're deported, they lose their family, they lose the ability to see their children and grandchildren. So that the taking away of the positive stimuli of family and the introduction of the negative stimuli in Tijuana can create a negative environment that can be seen as a criminogenic risk factor. Next is the social disorganization theory and the narco-kleptocracy. So social disorganization theory is that there's a lack of cohesion and collective interest in the community, which can result in an increase in criminal behavior. So when people aren't necessarily engaged in the community that they're in, increase in crime could happen. So Tijuana is a very transient society. It's the busiest land border crossing. Many people do not stick around there for a long time. And since many of these veterans don't have an opportunity to go anywhere else, they don't have family in Mexico, and most of their families in the United States, they are left behind in this transient society. So one thing that this Deported Veteran Safe House, the guy who runs it, told us is that there's a lot of petty crime, a lot of serious crime as well in Tijuana, to the point where if you leave lights outside your house, or if you leave a doormat, it could be stolen. So it's hard to settle into a place that has this sort of environment, including corruption and cartel crime as well. Lastly, we have the financial autonomy, which is the enemy theory, falling into that deviant behavior is a symptom of lack of fit between culturally prescribed aspirations and socially structured methods of getting there. So if most of these veterans are from Southern California, specifically San Diego, where the mean income is $79,000 versus in Tijuana, where it's just $11,000, there's a great disparity in the quality of life between these two cities. Many of the deported veterans have only access to sort of limited job opportunities in Tijuana because they don't have much training, and that sort of disassociation between the two can create an increase in crime. So like I said before, this sort of results in three negative impacts for veterans. Some get involved in gang activity because it sort of takes advantage of their skills that they have from the military, and they find some community in the gang. Next is continued substance abuse and addiction. It's the worst to be involved in substance abuse when they're first deported. A lot of them relapse into it, and many of the substance abuse related issues are heavily related to their service. So that's something that comes from them helping and serving Americans. And mental illness is often not addressed. So if they were in the United States, they'd have the full backing of the Veterans Affairs sort of benefits, but because they're in Mexico, they don't have full access to the strength of the Veterans Affairs ecosystem to help support them in their PTSD or any sort of mental illness that has resulted from their service. So they really lose access to those benefits.
Okay, thank you. Our final speaker for panel 1 will be Alexandra Jacobs, International Affairs and History.
Hello, I'm Alex. I'm going to be talking about my research for my International Affairs Honors in the Major project, which is looking at LGBT and climate-induced migrants to examine how the current structures of the international refugee regime exclude certain groups. So I want to start by providing some extremely brief background information on the international legal context in terms of refugee rights for these groups. The primary treaty defining what a refugee is and articulating the rights of people who are granted asylum is the 1951 Refugee Convention and its 1967 protocol. And this is the working definition of a refugee that I have on the slide. And this is what the international community is working with at this point. And really this convention and the 1967 protocol lay out the basics of the international refugee regime. And then there are a number of documents like UN and associated bodies, treaties, conventions, principles, etc., that detail the application of this convention to groups like LGBT migrants and climate-induced migrants to some extent as well, but that's a bit more of a complicated situation. So to sort of summarize the position of the two groups, technically LGBT people are protected under the membership of a particular social group clause in this definition, if they can demonstrate a fear of persecution based on that membership. And this construction, even though they're technically protected, really complicates the process for them. And then the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees has consistently said that people fleeing adverse effects of climate change may be protected and they may have valid claims for refugee status under the convention, especially when climate change and disaster situations are intertwined with conflict and violence. But this is also complicated because there's not an internationally recognized definition for this population. And there are a number of different terms used to describe this population, from like climate migrants, environmental migrants, climate-induced migrants, etc. So their protection is not very concrete and their position is pretty precarious as well. And I also just wanted to take a second to note that while I'm looking at LGBT and climate-induced migrants and their access to their human and refugee rights, it would be pretty reductive of me to not mention that they generally also have a number of other social, political, economic reasons for migrating as well. And those often fit a bit better into this working definition of what a refugee is. So in my full project, I go through a couple of case studies for each group of migrants and trace them throughout the migration experience. And here I'm just going to run through two pretty quick examples that are very small pieces of much broader stories. And so for LGBT migrants, one of the case studies I look at is people moving from Iran through Turkey and then to the US and Canada. And for a bit more context, LGBT people who are seeking refugee status have to prove both that their sexual orientation or gender identity is credible and that they have a well-founded fear of persecution because of it. So they have to really deliberately construct a personal narrative that demonstrates those things. And in terms of looking, I chose Iran, Turkey, US, Canada, mostly because Turkey is actually really interesting as a transit country. So while the UNHCR processes asylum cases, which can take many, many years, the Turkish government assigns refugee applicants to satellite cities throughout the country. And they will actually explicitly send LGBT refugees to conservative cities to expose the local population to LGBT people and open their minds, which leads to further discrimination in a number of ways, really like additional day-to-day discrimination that just adds to the structural discrimination they're facing throughout the UNHCR application process. So this creates this paradoxical situation where these refugees who are theoretically under the protection of international human and refugee rights regimes and apparatuses are actually stripped of their rights. And this is where the intersection of rightfulness and rightlessness comes in. And then for climate-induced migrants, one of the case studies that I'm looking at is people moving from Tuvalu to New Zealand or Australia. So Tuvalu is a nine-island archipelago. And in terms of climate change effects, there's a lot, but just for one example, 2 of the 9 islands are already on the verge of being submerged due to sea rise. And that's, one example out of a lot of things that they're facing. And most people don't want to leave. That's kind of their last resort because it's their home, it's their culture, etc. But many people do intend to migrate in the coming years. and a number of Tuvaluans have already migrated to New Zealand, and this population continues to grow every year. And there's a lot of international discussion about the Tuvalu population being the first large group of climate refugees. And in terms of international proposals for solutions, there's a wide range. And one that is really interesting is that the former Australian Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, proposed that Tuvalu citizens could be offered full citizenship in exchange for their country's maritime and fisheries rights. And the Tuvaluan Prime Minister at the time rejected this as imperial thinking, which brings me into a shared theme, one of a few shared themes that I've found between the two groups, and that's the perpetuation of dangerous stereotypes and relationships between first world, generally destination countries, and third world, generally origin countries. So for LGBT migrants, there's this idea that in destination countries, sexual diversity is celebrated, whereas origin countries are homophobic and frequently violate international human rights standards. And there's a quote that I found in my research that I think sums this up really well. And it's that there's a moment of transnational judgment when the decision makers of one nation decide not only on the credibility of the individual asylum claimant, but on the errors or strengths of the protection of rights in the country from which the claimant flees. And even though the author who said that is just discussing the experiences of LGBT migrants, it's not entirely different for climate migrants, because we're in this situation where the countries that have contributed the most to climate change are not the countries and are not the populations that are most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. So to conclude, I want to talk about a couple of potential solutions, and really the goal is to ensure that all migrants are fully protected and have full access to their human and refugee rights in the future, and to do that as soon as possible. And that will take a lot of work in a lot of different areas. So these are just a few out of many, many potential solutions. I mentioned earlier that there's no internationally recognized definition of a climate migrant. So in terms of legitimizing the field of environmental migration and sort of figuring out where they do fit in the current international refugee situation, that's a really important next step. Also, based kind of on that shared theme that I was just discussing, a less Eurocentric, less homogenized version of refugee and asylum application processes is important, and processes that work better for more diverse populations. Additionally, more research. I think one thing that I've really found is that there are a lot of similarities between the two groups, and by looking at the similarities and doing more research, we can see where the current system is lacking and what the gaps are, and then we can come up with more concrete solutions to move forward. And then adjusting the international refugee regime specifically through the 1951 Convention is a pretty controversial potential solution, but it's arguably the most obvious possibility, kind of the first thing that would come to your brain. So I thought I would mention it, but that's I think a lot of experts aren't really looking to do that at this point. So then, yeah, to conclude, it's really what I found is that LGBT and climate-induced migrants really are at that intersection of rightfulness and rightlessness, and they're in very liminal, precarious positions given the current constructions of refugee and human rights, and international and national experiences kind of exacerbate each other throughout the process. And there's a really long way to go, and we need to start addressing it and fixing it now, because there are already very real, very human individual impacts of these current constructions for both LGBT and climate-induced migrants.
Thank you very much. Three wonderful presentations, and we do have several questions in the chat. I will go ahead and start with the first one, and this is for Linda and Matthew. First, could you define criminogenic? And secondly, is the research question based on an observed high rate of criminal activity among the deported veterans?
So criminogenic risk factor is sort of a term that we use in criminology to identify different sort of things that can impact someone's criminal behavior. So it's basically just a term to use to elaborate on that. They're risk factors that can result in criminal activity, making them criminogenic. And then I don't know if Matthew wants to take the next one there.
Yes, could the second question be repeated?
Yes. Is the research question based on an observed high rate of criminal activity among the deported veterans?
Yes, it is. So through volunteering through the support house and going year after year, I've met a lot of the veterans who fall into these patterns or veterans associated who have been involved with these criminal activities. Especially with contact with like substance abuse was the most common one I saw. Suicide, I knew 2 veterans who committed suicide from this, and none of the veterans I personally met at the support house got involved in gang or cartel engagement. But through the ACLU, who commonly came to the support house, they were in more contact with groups and did research with them. So we were using their sourcing.
Okay. The next question is for Alex. Is there that similar feeling amongst LGBT migrants of loss of one's home?
Yeah, I think I've definitely seen that. There's another quote that I found from a person who did a study where he interviewed Iranian men who were in Turkey going through the process. And one of the men said that as a gay man, you can have everything and nothing here in Iran. You can have the best job, best car, best house, but you cannot be yourself. You have to lie all the time just to not get into any trouble, and then you have to leave. So I think there's definitely still that sort of longing, I guess, for their home, but kind of needing to prioritize some other things in their life too. So yeah, I've definitely seen that too.
Okay, the next question is also for Alex. Does this research engage in the critical queer theory of Jasbir Puar regarding homo nationalism?
I haven't been yet, but I will look into it to maybe add some more ideas.
Okay. The next question is also for Alex. How are the refugees that come supported with their mental well-being economically and socially when they arrive?
Yeah, I think I'm assuming this is when they arrive in destination countries. And that's kind of the last part of when I go through the case studies, I'm tracing them throughout the whole experience and talking about how national experiences in destination countries too are also not great and kind of don't deal with a lot of the traumatic aspects of the whole migration process. Specifically, I talk about for LGBT refugees in the US, the fact that they're in a double marginalized position now where they have multiple marginalized identities as queer people and as migrants. And then I also talk a lot more about how they're sort of, like I was saying, they have to prove their identity and like a fear of persecution, and how when they're going through the process, they have to really like demonize and villainize their home countries in a way to ensure that they're believed throughout the interview process, and how the impacts of that are not really talked about or discussed in destination countries. So I think the answer is kind of that they're not super well supported, and that's something that I'm talking about or trying to talk about too.
Okay, thank you. And this next question is for all the panelists. First, it's a thank you for 3 excellent presentations. And can each panelist tell us more about how the research questions you are asking relate to the courses you have taken? And perhaps a few sentences on whether your research inspires specific action for yourselves.
I can start. So I think 2 themes for my coursework are exemplified in this research project. First, the concept of environmental justice, which I think often people think about as disproportionate environmental burdens on communities of color and low-income communities. But another really big part of environmental justice is equal participation in decision-making. And that has been something that is really important in this project, making sure that these communities are able to express how the money would best help their communities, because they are the experts in the urgent needs of their community. And so I think the second point of my coursework that's reflected here is brought from my experiences in the service learning program, and really thinking about how to empower communities in their own futures and again, bringing forward this local knowledge that is really not representative on any government level. So I think that that has always been really important throughout this process, why we brought on a community partner, Fairmount Indigo, to have that perspective on our team. And I think looking at the second question about research inspiring specific actions, I'm really excited to see how we can translate this information in really accessible ways and unique to climate exchange, often producing very long technical reports. And I'm excited to challenge everyone to think about how we can democratize this data and make sure it is easily accessible for communities who actually need it, and pushing the organization to be more just and more democratic with its data. So I'm excited to present to some different community organizations and figure out how we can make videos and graphics in a way that makes it really accessible.
For myself, the criminological theories are really come from my criminology classes, specifically one that I took last year when Matthew and I started this project, as well as sort of like organized crime classes that I've taken. And it's really inspired us to take this project that we've had and presented at multiple different research forums, including we were just accepted to present this at Posters at the Hill, where we're hoping to advocate for the passing of the bill to get sort of our patriots repatriated. So we're really taking it in that direction.
And then I'm building off what Linda just said about how we're trying to like raise awareness. Since we presented this also at RISE last year, we've really seen how the clear issue with the deported veteran crisis is an issue of acknowledgement, and very few individuals are even aware that non-citizens serve in the US military, let alone that they can be deported. So it's been really cool for Linda and I to like work together and try to like bring more awareness to the issue. So then hopefully when the bill does reach a floor further down the line, that like we hope that like more people will know about it, or it won't be as much of a niche issue as it currently is.
For me, my project was born out of a class I was taking last spring. I was studying abroad at Sciences Po Paris, and I took a migration law from theory to advocacy class. And for my final paper, I did a lot of the work that I'm talking about in this project on LGBT migrants, because that's a topic that I'm interested in and like relates to me personally. And I find a lot of enjoyment in learning more about it in different disciplines. So that was why I chose that topic then. And then as I was thinking about doing an international affairs honors project, I just like couldn't stop thinking about expanding upon that project, because at the very end of that paper, I talked about how I thought environmental migrants and LGBT migrants are in a kind of similar position. So I just like kind of couldn't stop thinking about that over the summer, and that's how I got here. And in terms of inspiring specific actions, for me, I think it's just reaffirmed, I guess, a lot of things like how much I care about some of these topics and how much I want to center human rights and marginalized populations, I think, moving forward in my work.
Okay, wonderful. All right, the next question is, how much time and effort was put into such research projects? And by the way, great job. The questioner also wanted to commend you on your work.
I guess we could just go in the same order again. Yeah, I started working on this project probably around October, November through my co-op, and then have been working full-time at Climate Exchange on this project through now. So a good amount of time, and we did around 30 interviews. So yeah.
I would say like for me, like when I first started volunteering at the support house in 2018, I didn't expect it to really come into research, but like we kind of combined it last year in like 2020 in the winter, and since then it's been really like on and off, but it's always kind of like an evolving project in a lot of ways.
Yeah, for me, like I mentioned, I started this last semester in the spring, or last spring semester, in 2020, and then I kind of put it down for a while, like over the summer, and came back to it in the fall when I was getting started. And then I've been expanding upon it throughout the semester and like adjusting the research I did a year ago and adding to looking at environmental migrants in the same sort of framework and kind of combining them and looking more at solutions.
Okay, I think we've got another question, or another question that's about to be expressed orally.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. I asked if I could express my question orally because I just couldn't type it fast enough. There's a thing that I noticed, a theme that seemed to run through all the presentations, which is that there is a dearth of just listening to people and responding to what they need, right? That's certainly the theme of Ava's project, is that, you know, in engaging with communities, we need to make sure we're listening to what they need, because as you said, they are experts in their local needs. And similarly in Matthew and Linda's projects, you know, nobody's asking veterans, like, what, you know, non-citizen veterans, what would help you now that you've done this thing for us? And of course, in Alex's project, there's that really complicated thing of refugees having to express themselves in terms of what we think the stories we think they should be telling, rather than whatever their story might actually be, whether it be a little more ambivalent or complicated. And I also noticed there were definitions running around, like criminogenic, which I asked for the understanding of, and then Alex, you've described the way that it really matters whether you fall into a definition, right, under the UNHCR protocols. So my question really was just wanting to ask the panelists if they could meditate a little bit, if anybody wants to, on sort of where do these definitions come from? Why are they important in these processes? And how do they have an impact on vulnerable populations? It looks like Ava wanted to jump in on that, or you lean forward.
Could speak to it, I guess. I mean, I think I use the word vulnerable populations a lot in my piece, and that can be very broad. And I think, you know, defining vulnerable populations and categories serves to have some benefits and also some negative impacts as well. And particularly in the environmental justice space, they're fighting really strongly right now to get more enhanced definitions of environmental justice communities in Massachusetts so they can be better protected. So I think it goes to, you know, identifying where populations need to be prioritized, especially when they've been historically and disproportionately affected by climate change and the pandemic, but also excluded from the benefits of the resources. So I think it's important to look back historically at what populations have not been benefiting and make sure they're defined and prioritized moving forward. Hope that answered got to your question, but yeah.
Other thoughts?
I think for us, definitions are really critical in terms of setting the boundaries, because for Matthew and I, one of the main things with this project that we found complicated was defining exactly like what part of it is worth including and sort of which risk factors we should address. And by having sort of definitions that we pulled from multiple different textbooks and sort of combined from different research journals, that was really good for us to sort of set clear boundaries as to what things in the atmosphere, what experiences that the veterans deal with fall into different categories. So it was really helping us in like organizational fashion.
Thank you.
I think for me, in terms of environmental or climate migrants, one of the things that I've found is just that it's very hard to have a cohesive international discussion without a standard word to describe this population or a standard phrase to describe this population. And if you can't have like that cohesive discussion, how can you figure out where they fit into the international refugee regime and how do they fit into the 1951 Refugee Convention. So I think that's one of the biggest things I found, but also in a weird way, by defining them, there's a lot of concern that by defining them, that will make it seem like climate change is the only driver for these people's migration, and that's often not the case. So there's this kind of situation where there needs to be a definition so that we can have a constructive conversation, and so that everyone can know exactly who we're talking about, but also that we don't want to be reductive of, reductive of their other experiences and the other things that are influencing their decisions.
Thank you.
Okay, I believe we have time for one more question. I don't see any more in the chat, but there may be some folks who have questions they would like to ask orally. Sorry, oh, here's one more that, oh, was there? There's one more in the chat. Unless there was somebody heard a voice. Is there somebody speaking up? Okay, well, I'll go to we'll make this last question in the chat be the final question. How was the process of proposing the research projects?
I think I went through a little bit of a two-phase process proposing the project. First to Climate Exchange as an organization, and then second to making my capstone project. So I think that the first phase of that really was, why is this project important? Why should we be doing this at Climate Exchange? It's not an environmental justice organization, but working to be more into that realm. So why is this important? Why should we be the ones who are going to do it? And how can we make this happen? And then the capstone project really pushed me to think a lot more about the theory of participatory action research and thinking about interview research, mixed methods, how we can analyze data through coding software, so much more academic. And so kind of, I think this project really reflects that political perspective of the report, but also the academic perspective of the report as well.
So I'd say for our project, the big proposal is really my proposal to Linda, because previously I don't have a criminology background, but I kind of knew about the deported veterans and really had that kind of experience, but I had no real idea about like the theories or anything like that. And so I kind of knew it, well, we both were interested in RISE at the time. So like we talked about it here or there, and then like it was a big proposal, like get Linda on board, who was like super helpful to explain the theories and kind of make a lot of things I saw at the support house like legitimized.
For me, it was mostly, I'm doing this as an honors in the major project. So there was a process of proposing it to my faculty advisor that I think is kind of similar to what Ava was saying, just talking about why it is important to even think about, and why, like, what questions is it answering and why are those questions important. And then there's also a process of like proposing it to count as my capstone, because it's not technically a capstone. That was like kind of not more formal, but a bit more complicated.
Okay, thank you, all of you. These are wonderful presentations. It's time to move on to the next panel. And I just wanted to say that there are also several thank yous in the chat section as well. And good job. There are also several good jobs, everyone in the chat section.
Thank you to the panelists and to Dr. Davis. Can everybody hear me okay? Great, thank you. My name is Tom Vicino. I'm professor of political science, public policy and urban affairs. That's a long title. It's great to see so many familiar faces today. We're now transitioning to panel 2, which is called Policy Matters. And our first panelist is John Harrington, who is studying mechanical engineering and economics. And so without further ado, John, can I turn it over to you?
Yes, thank you, Professor. I'll just get my presentation up now. Can everyone see that yet? No?
Not yet. We still see you.
Not yet.
Excellent. Okay, I can fix that.
There
How
we go.
about now?
Yep.
Perfect. All right. Bipartisanship is not a concrete term, but generally represents the level of agreement and compromise that exists during the United States congressional process. In our hyper-partisan era, it can appear at times that there is no room in politics for bipartisanship anymore. Considering that, it is more important than ever to investigate factors that influence how this division waxes and wanes. Previous research has indicated that there exists a correlation between certain economic indicators focusing on unemployment and certain metrics representing congressional bipartisanship, demonstrating that a stronger economy correlated with higher levels of bipartisanship. This study focused on 20th century data and demonstrated with a high confidence that there existed a correlation between these metrics. Likewise, the dramatic effects that the federal government can have on the economy would suggest that there may exist a connection between bipartisanship between the political elite and the state of the future economy. Further, it is possible that these effects of the economy on bipartisanship may differ based on the content of legislation. One may expect that the gap between already divisive topics may grow wider as the economy falters and parties regroup towards their bases, compared to more agreeable subject matters. The purpose of the study is to bring this data into the 21st century and determine whether or not this correlation is maintained in our increasingly divisive era. Two distinct methods of measuring bipartisanship were calculated and compared, relating to voting and sponsorship, to investigate the impacts and meanings of these two different metrics. In order to calculate the required metrics, there would need to be relatively detailed data sets for querying, for the different metric methods, as well as to split up the data by time and topic. While certain data sets, such as voting and individual partisanship scores, are readily available, there did not exist an open source platform for this flexible dataset generation. For that reason, I decided to develop an open source political data framework that would allow me to generate various datasets for different research questions. I called this framework Politici. This framework uses existing open source APIs to web scrape and a comprehensive dataset directly from the United States Congressional Archives. This data is then stored in a relational database whose schema is seen on the right. This relational database allows separate tables to be linked together for complicated querying and analysis. For example, a politician would have multiple terms linked to it, allowing a tracking of a member's career over time based on different positions, roles, or even parties. Each of these politicians would be linked to bills via their sponsorships, either as the primary sponsor or one of many co-sponsors. These bills can have multiple states as they are modified and moved around the different congressional bodies, and relate to different distinct topics as defined by the Congressional Archive themselves. Without going into too much further detail, this framework could be used to quickly generate and develop many different types of data sets and has large potential for future research applications. During the development of the framework, various data sets and metrics were generated separate to this research topic. This included a rudimentary machine learning model to predict legislation vote likelihood, an optimal sponsorship recommendation method for a given bill content, and the most viable cross-party votes recommendation system that can allow a higher probability of bill passage. So if anyone would like to learn more about this or is interested in using the framework for their research, please feel free to contact me. As mentioned before, bipartisanship has no formal quantitative definition. For that reason, two metrics were calculated and evaluated. Following prior work, the first metric was based on voting tendencies. For each period of time, the proportion of votes that were considered bipartisan was calculated. For this metric, a vote was considered bipartisan if either both parties' majority voted the same way, which means either most of both parties voted for or against the bill, or if the proportion of support for the vote was within a 20% cutoff for each party. The reason 20% was chosen as it was the cutoff used in prior research and was the best for comparison. A result of this metric, aggregated by year for visualization, can be seen in the top of the figure. A distinct drop can be seen after 2010 until 2019, and this could be a result of certain key events or changes during the congressional composition, and I think is an area for further research. The second metric was based off cross-party sponsorships and is based off the Lugar score, which is a bipartisanship metric developed by the Lugar Center, a bipartisan think tank. It takes the proportion of cross-party sponsorships compared to the total number of sponsorships for each party during a period of time. This is to represent cross-party collaboration that exists during the legislative drafting process. From this, we expect that the 0 represents that no cross-party sponsorships are occurring during the period, and that a 1 represents an equal level of sponsorship from the originating party as well as the other. An interesting artifact of the data, when aggregated as it is in the bottom of the figure, is that there is a 2-year pattern that it seems to appear, where during the first year of new Congress, there exists a higher level of sponsorship-based partisanship than during the last year. This is a very interesting find and could represent another pattern of political collaboration that occurs throughout the election cycle. Contrary to expectations, the two metrics do not correlate very well when attempted. I would show that graph, but it was very messy, so I decided not to. This potentially indicates that these two metrics are not necessarily representing the same behavior, and that the way that politicians collaborate on drafting and sponsoring legislation may not carry over when casting the vote. Moving over to preliminary results, it turns out that there does not appear to be a strong linear correlation between economic metrics and bipartisanship metrics during the 21st century. As can be seen on the right, the unemployment rate, the key variable in the previous study, does not explain a significant level of variance in the bipartisanship metrics. Various regression models were also run, controlling for separate economic metrics, such as national growth rate and consumer price index percent change, without reducing model variance. Based on these results, it is possible that the previous correlation between bipartisanship metrics and the economic metrics does no longer reflect reality in the 21st century. While congressional compromise may have been valuable during strong economies to gather moderate voters in the past, as previous work has theorized, it is possible that in the increasingly partisan political landscape, that incentive no longer holds weight. Bipartisanship scores were also evaluated for individual topics, and when modeled against economic data, model validity did appear to differ based on the bill content, which did support the initial hypothesis. However, the dataset was too sparse to provide any level of confidence, even when aggregated at different timescales. Based on that topic sparsity, the first step in future work is to improve the data density for these key topics that we're choosing. Potential methods would include aggregating topics to reduce the number of categories. However, due to the large number of topics provided by the Congressional Archive in the numbers of thousands, this would be a job best left to a data aggregation model rather than manually done. Additionally, it would be beneficial to use a wider time band. However, there currently are data limitations since the Congressional Archive has only been providing topic identifiers for the last 20 years of data. In order to overcome this, it could be beneficial to develop a topic classification model to backfill the topics of older bills based on the bill text themselves. This much larger time band could allow for more complete modeling with denser data sets in the future. Further, following adjacent work in congressional network science, another sponsorship-based bipartisanship metric that would be valuable to study would be sponsorship networks, which use sponsorships to or from a politician as edges on a network graph. This graph can be analyzed during periods of time to represent clustering or closeness of a network graph. And that's clustering or closeness would represent potentially a form of bipartisanship and the nature of how collaboration occurs at the congressional level. Continuing on the results of no correlation found between unemployment and these metrics during the recent time period, it would be valuable to extend the previous work into the 21st century, including data in both the 20th and the 21st century together. Comparisons between the updated model and the original could provide even more insight into the differences between these two time periods. Thank you very much for listening to the work, and I'm looking forward to questions in the panel.
Thank you, John, for that excellent presentation. Our next panelist is Kieran Hederman, who is studying political science and international affairs. Kieran, can I turn it over to you now?
Of course. Give me 1 second to set up my screen share. All right, can everyone see this? Good?
Yeah, you're good to go.
So I'm really excited to share this research project, which was for my capstone, Ideology, Indigeneity, Indigenous Politics in a World of Nations. As any of my friends in the audience could tell you, brevity is not really my strong suit, so I'm going to try my best here. So in 1923, the delegation of the Six Nations of the Iroquois, also known as the Haudenosaunee, arrived at the League of Nations in Geneva, Switzerland. They were led by a sort of extraordinary figure, a former lumberjack turned statesman named Levi General, but he's better remembered by his chiefly title, Descahe. Descahe was angry with American and Canadian encroachment on the Iroquois traditional lands and also their political autonomy. And he sought League of Nations recognition of the Six Nations sovereignty. His cause became something of a cause célèbre in Geneva, and he became something of a local celebrity. He would attend meetings in his full chiefly regalia, and he actually did manage to swing the support of several important countries, including the Netherlands and Japan, which was very politically embarrassing for the US and even more so for the British Empire. So let me now fast forward a few decades to a very sharply contrasting anecdote. In 1995, as Quebec was preparing for a referendum on independence, the Cree Nation fought tooth and nail to remain part of Canada, on the grounds that tribal sovereignty prevented Quebec from compelling them to leave Canada, and thereby absolving the Canadian government of their treaty obligations to the Cree Nation. So I was fascinated by these two stories, which offer such strongly contrasting visions for the position of Indigenous communities within the nation-state paradigm. They highlighted this friction between Indigenous and non-Indigenous national political movements, which really appear to share a lot of basic similarities. So with that in mind, my goal was to examine the social and ideological origins of Indigenous political movements and to identify through comparative analysis of case studies how Indigenous identitarian political movements differ from non-Indigenous nationalisms. And in doing so, I wanted to figure out where the various tendencies within Indigenous political thought lie in relation to the dominant nationalist paradigm. And here's the big shocker, it depends. So I won't bore you with my working definitions. If anybody's interested, we can maybe touch on that in the Q&A. But suffice it to say, the diversity of groups which could be considered Indigenous required me to pull examples from some very different cultural, historical, and geographic contexts. So eventually I arrived at a thesis. While beliefs, ambitions, and tactics vary immensely among Indigenous political movements, I believe that these movements fall broadly into two distinct but related categories, which I've called Indigenous nationalism and then Indigenism proper, which I just referred to as Indigenism. So basically all prominent streams of Indigenous politics take for granted two key attributes of nationalism, as defined by this guy, Benedict Anderson, who sort of provided the common working definition. The nation, first of all, however it is constructed, is inherently entitled to self-determination. And secondly, nationalism is modular, which is great, but what does that mean? So, move on to some definitions that I am going to give you. So nationalism is a political ideology which states that a certain group constitutes a nation, which is an imagined political community, which is both limited and sovereign, and is therefore entitled to a nation's right of self-determination. What is a modular ideology? That basically means that the ideology, once established, can be transposed to different contexts. The nationalist framework is particularly salient as an example, because once a critical mass develops, it essentially became self-duplicating. Once a nation is formed, it compels the other nations around it or other groups around it to engage with it on its own terms. So it commands belief in a certain paradigm of conduct, not just proper practice. This makes it different from some other forms of modular politics, like the labor movement, which focused very strongly on a process rather than a sort of system of belief. And if it sounds like I'm describing a religion here, then you kind of get the gist. So how does this fit together in the real world? Well, I'm going to have you look at my cases. So I focused on 4 main cases, and then I contrasted them with sort of locally relevant cases of non-Indigenous national movements, and one sort of edge case. So I have the case of the Cree that I mentioned earlier, the Kabyle Berbers in Algeria, the Sami in Scandinavia, and the Maori in New Zealand. And I was surprised to find that in all of these cases, you have a strong political emphasis on traditional decision-making processes that deal primarily with small scale, or I don't want to use that because that could come off as insignificant, but very locally concentrated governance issues. With the Cree, that's a tribal system. The Kabyle in Algeria have something that are called Arosh, which have sort of reemerged in the last 2 decades, and they've been very innovative and deserve a lot more time than I can give them here. The Sami have a socio-economic unit called the Sida, and the Maori nations were actually quite centralized, which resulted in more favorable terms when it came time to negotiate treaties with the British. The big fault line is over the meaning of indigenous sovereignty. So in some cases, the groups will pursue what I came to call the de-indigenization of the community, which is to say a nation state in Descaje's model. Many of the Kabyle in Algeria see this as a necessary goal due to discrimination by the state, which officially espouses Arab nationalism. But they're not the only example. The Kurds spring to mind. That was a Pandora's box I kind of wanted to avoid opening. And I use Finland actually in comparison to the case of the Sami as an example of this goal pursued successfully. It's kind of an edge case, but there's a lot of similarities when you actually dig into it. The other side of the coin is what you see with the Cree and the Sami, who developed mediating institutions within the nation state. In the case of the Sami, Finland, Sweden, and Norway, and in the case of the Cree with Canada. And these institutions have essentially serve to advocate for the community's interest within the existing state. And this is what has come to be called indigenism by a lot of scholars, including in this context me. And it's more common among relatively small and dispersed groups which historically relied on trade to survive. In some cases, such as with the Inuit and the Cree and Canada, the population today is actually larger than it ever was historically when they were existing through traditional modes of production. And so trade, especially in things like food and medicine, has become essential to the survival of these groups. They just don't have the natural resources in their traditional territories to survive sort of off of those resources alone. So having the presence of a state is in sort of interstitiary structure between them and the global economy and global systems of trade has become significantly more important due to their geographic circumstances.
Just a 1 minute warning here, Kieran.
All right, should be good to go. So the interesting thing that I found is that indigenism in this model is also modular and very deliberately so. Which is due in large part to the prominent role that the Sami and the Cree took when this whole movement was taking shape in the 1970s and 80s. I'm going to gloss over New Zealand. That's an interesting case, but I don't think I have the time. And I'm just going to cut straight to the summary, which is, despite assertions to the contrary by their practitioners, many of whom I have a very deep respect for, we basically need to understand the various strains of indigenous political thought as products of the nationalist paradigm. In the case of the indigenous nationalisms, this is fairly straightforward, but in the case of indigenism, it means looking at it as a sort of corollary to nationalism, a distinct modular ideology which takes place within the same sort of intellectual paradigm. And that's sort of where I arrived with my research, and I probed that a little bit further in my 30-page paper than I can here, but thank you.
Thank you for that excellent presentation. Our final speaker today is, our second to last speaker today is Lion Lee in economics. Lion, can I turn it over to you?
Thanks so much, Professor. Just quick wondering, could everyone see the screen?
Yes, you're good to go.
Thanks so much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for everyone's support. My name is Leon. I'm a 5th year student here in Northeastern studying economics. So I'm just wondering, first of all, I want to talk about the focus of my this research. This really focused about the role of sovereign bond play in the Europe's free bond market, and trying to provide a policy analysis about the recent reform which is taking place. I'll talk about my motivation a little bit, because we know that given 2008 financial crisis, financial stability, and especially banking crisis has become a huge issue, both in the States here and also across the world, in this case, in Europe. And Lehman Brothers first has its finance issues because they failed to get financial capital from the repo market. So what I'm doing here, I'm trying to provide a structural analysis about the institutional design in the Europe, and trying to underline the potential underlying risk. So the next banking crisis, when it hits, we know how to avoid it and how can we improve our institution even further. So let's talk about what is repo. So it's a very introductory. So So repo is really short-term borrowing through repurchase agreement between different parties. So in this case, I'm talking about repo by the banking entities. So banks, they will conduct a repurchase agreement with each others. And the time can be varies. And most oftenly, which is over the night, which is called overnight repo. One bank will give the cash to the others. However, in exchange, they will give securities, and that was called collaterals. So how big is the size about this repo market in Europe? Before 2008 financial crisis, about 6.5 trillion euros. And after the financial crisis has recovered after 2012, in 2019, before the COVID-19 crisis hits, it's about 8 trillion euros, which is a really big market. So people might ask, what's wrong with this market? Why is there financial instabilities? The answer is that because the security which is they use, which is the collateral, it's mainly sovereign bonds. And these create a huge risk, which is called sovereign exposure risk. So in order to get that deep dive on this even further, so I would to introduce a relationship between the state and bank. And this in the academic field often called the sovereign bank doom loop. Next, I show a diagram analysis about this relationship. As we can see here, in the between sovereign and domestic banks, this really happened because there's two direct links. Because when banks have very low capital, it starts failing, the state will intervene to try to save the bank. However, in order doing so, the balance sheet, the capital of the state also became very weak in terms of fiscal capacities. As a result, their sovereign bonds are losing its values, which is the portfolio of the banks. And these create a very vicious cycles. In the next slide, I will talk about what's really the relationship in a much more sensible way. As we talk about the vicious cycle, really became a stronger issue because of weak public finance and vulnerabilities in the banking sectors. In Europe, the direct domestic bank balance sheets, they deteriorate portfolio as a country default. In the case of Spain, the default risk in the case of Greece, and also the risk faced by Spain. As these states face more pressure to bail out, and this caused even bigger a crisis, a banking crisis. That's also indirect link. Because of sovereign risk premium, this is really the different interest rates in the euro area, because every country issues their own sovereign debt. And because the fiscal capacity of different states is different, the interest rate is also becoming different. When the financial crisis hits, the interest rate between the different bonds really widens. And this is what's called the risk premium. And these for countries who are very fiscally distressed countries like Greece, like Spain, or even Italy, very difficult to borrow money as interest rates goes up. The cost of borrowing is much higher, and therefore the economy of those countries are much more difficult. And what does this impact have on the monetary policies? This, in fact, has huge implications because ECB's the monetary policy, in order to work, it has to work smoothly in all euro area. If these interest rates only helps the country who had a very strong fiscal capacities, however, does not really help even have high interest rates in fiscally distressed countries, the transmission mechanism of ECB has been broken. And so hopefully I make a point that the monetary system, the transmission mechanism over here have some issues. But how to address that? What ECB can really do? People might say that, as a monetary economist, say that we can use asset purchase program, which also known as quantitative easing, buying more long-term assets, buying treasury bonds, therefore to reduce interest rates. That's a great answer. However, that's no common treasury bond in Europe. So how do we buy that? So as these become very political contested issues, should the ECB buy the sovereign bond issued by Greece in order to reduce its interest rates? the Norwegian countries or Germany might oppose that. In fact, there had been 2 times the Bundesbank, which is central bank of Germany, bring to the European Court of Justice, ECJ, 2 times, arguing things that being unfair and trying to build other countries without macroeconomic adjustment progress.
1 minute.
This is the last slide. So what has been working in the current policy reform? So that has been a lot of suggestions, a lot of reform has been doing. Well, mostly I want to point out is European stability mechanism and the financial support about 700 billion capacity. So the next time when a country faces distress, this mechanism can come and intervene and try to solve the issues. However, there are also a lot of things has been missing. For example, there's no European deposit insurance schemes such as FDIC here in the US. So this is something a lot of economists really hope we can accomplish and trying to have these deposit insurance schemes and trying to make complete a banking union in Europe. That's all for today. I'm happy to talk more questions in the Q&A sections. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you, Leon, for that excellent presentation. And now our final presentation is from Jasper Duval, studying health sciences and sociology. Jasper, can I turn it over to you now?
Yes, hello.
Hello.
Can everybody see my screen?
Yes,
good?
you are
All right.
Good to go.
Awesome. So, hello everybody. My name is Jasper, and I'm an undergraduate research assistant for Dr. Liza Weinstein. And on this project that I'm working on, I worked with Tufts undergraduate Amit Gavalanche and population health PhD candidate Saloni Dev. So, my project is called The Shame of the Slum, Mental Health and Territorial Stigma in Calibunder. So, to start us off, Calibunder is a non-notified informal settlement on a former port in southeast Mumbai, and the land that it's on is owned by the Mumbai Port Trust, which is a central government agency. So notification status refers to whether or not the government legally recognizes the settlement. So through notification status, informal settlements can gain access to water, to sanitation, electricity, and other infrastructure. However, there is no way to notify informal settlements that are on central government land. India is made up of states, and so state government land is usually the pathway through which these informal settlements gain notification status. So that means that Calibunder, it is in a unique position where it cannot access life-sustaining infrastructure in a legal way, and they have no pathway towards this. So the other kind of background information to know is about territorial stigma, which I put up a little definition on the screen. It's a type of discrimination based on where a person lives or is from. It's pretty much exactly what it sounds like. So some more familiar examples to like an American or Western audience might be the idea of a ghetto, slums, Hoovervilles, trailer parks, those kind of thing. These places are associated with poverty, marginalized groups, and crime, such as drugs, prostitution, and violence. So territorial stigma as a concept has really been gaining attention within the fields of public health and sociology in the form of more conceptual papers, but there really haven't been many papers that have data. And then the papers that do have data largely are focused in wealthy nations such as Canada and Japan. And no papers really have looked at informal settlements or slums, which is kind of the more popular but also stigmatizing word. So we combined this relatively new concept with this relatively new field, and we wanted to answer the question, how does territorial stigma impact mental well-being in Calibunder? So we pulled from the literature and came up with this theoretical framework to guide us as we conducted thematic coding. One of the former speakers talked about using Deduce. That's the platform that we use. So this framework that we came up with suggests that structural factors kind of go and create territorial stigma, which then through identity, community relations, discrimination, and infrastructural deficits impact mental well-being. So there's this little diagram in the corner there. We found that our diagram was a great place to start But as you can see here, things got a little complicated. So we found that some pathways had more evidence than others, and then many more of the pathways were linked. And as we were coding, we did find examples that made the connection between territorial stigma and mental health, and it made it very obvious. This first quote that we pulled, one informant said, "I feel like people treat us differently. I don't feel like I live in Mumbai. They don't consider us part of Mumbai. We live in garbage." This resident is clearly feeling the existence of stigma, which is then impacting their identity as a Mumbaiker, a resident of Mumbai, which in turn affects their mental health. And an interesting aspect that I really was focused on was this, we called it the third dimension, and we felt it was like a metaphorical spotlight over the whole pathway, the whole framework, which represented intersectionality and how other identities play into territorial stigma. So another informant said, if this person is understanding, then we can talk with them, but if not, then we can't. Here, the Madrasi people don't want to understand. Everyone is scared of the Madrasi people. So people from the South Indian state of Tamil Nadu, who are referred to as Madrasi here, are often victims of ethnic scapegoating, and their association with Kaulabundar contributes to the stigmatization of the space, both by outsiders, like people who are not residents, and also by Kaulabundar residents themselves. So, takeaways. While clearly we have complicated this framework that we started with, we did find it to be a useful tool for beginning to analyze our data. So it can absolutely be used by others who are going into territorial stigma research. Outside the field, territorial stigma is a new consideration for social justice work. So perhaps regarding gentrification or housing justice, just to throw out a couple examples, there are plenty of spaces within each of our locales that face a vicious cycle of symbolic and infrastructural degradation. So that's something to focus on. A side note here, we're kind of changing the language a little bit from territorial stigma to spatial stigma, which in the literature, they're both used interchangeably, but so it doesn't really matter, but that's just a little side note. And then finally, this provides new insight into the mental well-being of Kaulabundar residents, which will help us better understand and help to improve the situations of KB. But beyond KB, it can also be helpful for other non-notified settlements and how that non-notification status interacts with different ways of stigmatization and relating to that third dimension that I was talking about earlier. So currently I'm working on coding new data from Kaulabundar, exploring the effects of notification on health and well-being. So that will hopefully add to the discussion as well. So that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jasper, for that great presentation. We now have some time to have a quick conversation and question and answer. And I note that our chat window here has quite a number of questions that have come in. And so could I, looking for the earliest.
I think Dr. Nieves has a question.
Thank you, Laura. Dr. Nieves, can we go to you for that question? Do you mind? Can you unmute?
Muting.
Yeah, sorry, I was having a little trouble with that. I'm wondering if Siren might be able to, I probably said that wrong, might be able to talk about the challenges as a researcher of doing work in Indigenous communities and how you sort of address that as perhaps an outsider to that particular community. And I raised the issue of many Indigenous communities now require researchers, irrespective of what their research is, to sort of do a very personalized training to their particular community so that they can understand the issues and then collaborate, as opposed to sort of going in, taking information and not having a kind of ethically responsible way of doing the work. And I just wondered what your thoughts were and how you might have thought about some of that during your project.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And I'm glad you asked it. And I was not in a position, I mean, this was done in fall of 2020, so I was not really in a position to be going anywhere on the ground. And granted, I was dealing more on the, I guess, political theory asterisk side of things. So I was able to dodge some of those issues, but I think that it is a very relevant concern that a lot of these communities have, and a lot of the scholars who are trying to operate in that environment. And I think that there's an important balance to be found in an approach which is sensitive and responsive to the people you're working with. It's never good to feel like you're in a human zoo and just being studied for the sake of being studied. And so I think scholarship that is operating in these communities needs to understand that they don't exist to be observed. And I think that a good medium in there is ensuring that there is a more personal, immersive understanding of the community that the scholar's operating in, and ensuring that they're doing so in a way that is respectful and diligent. And then on the other hand, there's also an obligation of scholars to operate in a way that is, at least to some point, objective. And so I guess as an outsider, I was trying to be very conscious of the biases that I had going in. Conspicuously, none of these cases were from the United States, because I didn't want my own perceptions as an American to color how I thought of Indigenous issues and what an Indigenous community actually is. I didn't want to go in with the association that, oh, this is tribal, therefore we're going to be looking at everything from a tribal lens, and we can debate what that means. But yeah, no, I think you raise a really important question, and it's all sort of about finding the balance between a beneficial outsider's perspective as someone who can sort of make connections without the I guess, innate bias of someone who comes from that community, but also understanding that they're going to have more information than you do always. And you have to go about getting that in a way that is respectful and conscientious, and always with, the objective in mind.
That's great. And what you've outlined is essentially a methodology that talks about an ethics of care that we've, begun to talk a lot about in the humanities and in those interstitial spaces between the humanities and the social sciences. So thanks for that answer. Great answer.
Jasper, could I ask you to maybe also reflect on your work and the ethics of those different types of forms of engagement, if you will?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is something that I think a lot about. I'm in an ethnographic field experience class right now, so that's all I think about. But I didn't talk about how we got our data, but our team on this little bit of the project was using secondary data from a 2012 study, and all the data was actually collected by Barefoot researchers. So we, I guess the team went in and trained, I really don't know much about the process, which is probably bad, but they went and trained residents of Kaulabundar to engage with the community. So the people who are collecting the data are actually members of the community themselves. So both what we're doing now is we're collecting interview data that's life histories, but we're also collecting ethnographic field notes, and the people who are collecting the data are residents of Kaulabundar themselves, and a lot of I hesitate to describe them in this way, but the more senior, upper level team members have actually been to Kaulabundar themselves. I have not, because I am a mere undergraduate, and also plane tickets to India are expensive. So, but it's been a very self-reflexive process, and I definitely value that in social science research. So.
Great, thank you. I wonder if we might turn briefly for a comment and reflection, John and Leon, on your work and thinking about sort of what's motivated your work and how you've thought about using different methods to study different dimensions of economic outcomes, in terms of you both have used sort of data in really innovative and different ways. I wonder if you might reflect briefly on that. John, could we go to you first?
Absolutely. So I guess as a foundation in terms of classwork, I took the economics department's econometric course a couple of years ago, and that provided a really fantastic statistics foundation that sort of allowed me to understand how to use the different types of regressions and sort of how to approach problems like this from a numerical standpoint. When I was approaching this problem specifically, I mean, one of the major sort of reasons I sort of got into this field in general was that, you know, in 2020 in the election, everything coming around, I wanted to try and figure out if there's a better way to sort of track the actions of politicians. And I wanted to see, okay, well, there's certain websites where people are putting many, many hours of their individual effort trying to write up, so, oh, this person said they did this, but they actually voted this way. And that was amazing. But I realized that that's not scalable necessarily. And it doesn't work if you want to look at your state politics. And I was thinking, well, there has to be some sort of way we can use computers and some forms of automation to do this in a smarter way. And that's kind of what sort of drew me down this path of originally making the framework. And then based on that, when you're actually looking at the specific project, what kind of got me down that path was looking at and sort of recognizing that there is an increasing disparity and economic inequalities that are occurring across the United States, particularly over the last few years, but it isn't necessarily reflective in unemployment. And that's kind of brings me back, if you don't mind, I can kind of answer a second question that was brought up that Professor Green brought up about potentially other metrics that could represent and be a better economic representative than unemployment rate. And something that I hadn't implemented yet, but I was considering was the Gini coefficient, because the Gini coefficient is meant to represent economic inequality. And it's interesting because in some ways you would expect that during higher levels of unemployment, that there probably would be higher levels of economic inequality, as certain types of jobs that are lost are often ones that are easier to replace and easier to let go. But however, in the most recent years, you've actually seen it that the Gini coefficient has reflected even worse economic inequality, even while the unemployment rate has stayed low. And it kind of shows how these are not always correlated as well. And so I think that's probably what the next plan would be.
Thank you, John. And Leon, I'll give you the last word on the comment in terms of thinking about how you engage with data to sort of inform the questions you've been asking.
Thanks so much, professors. So my inspiration for this work really comes from the Basel III banking regulations. However, that is not enough because it's not enough to address the systematic institutional design in Europe in terms of banking framework. So this study was conducted while I was in France studying in Sciences Po under former central bankers. And what a lot of data thinks this is ongoing debate about whether the future direction about the euro, right? So a lot of data really happening in real time. And I was able to read a few reports from Bruegel, which is a major policy think tank in the Europe, also Peters Institute. A few very famous economists in this field, they have a lot of insight report on the topic. So by following them and also the Twitters and also the Peterson and Bruegel websites and the most recent reports, I was able to get data and analyze it. And I really appreciate today's speaking here. And that's all.
Thank you, Leon. Let me just say thank you to all four panelists. These were excellent presentations, and I really do appreciate the way that all of you have used innovative methods to engage in these types of questions, whether it's looking and using secondary data to really tackling really tough questions of how society and economy intersect through politics, and policy matters, indeed the title of our panel today. So Professor Green, can I turn it back over to you to wrap up?
Yes, thank you very much, Tom. This has been really wonderful work to hear and learn about, and I want to thank all of our presenters, all of our moderators. I guess that's really both of our moderators, all of the people who have chosen to spend this hour and a half with us and learn about this work. And I do also want to give a shout out to someone behind the scenes who's really been helping us along, which is Gabby Fiorenza, who has been running the chat and made sure that we all had presentations that would function. If you look at the chat, you will notice that there are links both to the program for today and next day, which you are welcome to download. And also a reminder that day 2 of the Undergraduate Research Forum will take place on Wednesday, March 31st from 3:30 to 5 in what you might call the same place. So I hope that some of you will be able to join us, perhaps bring your friends and tell your friends. And I also wanted to remind you, oh right, that a recording of tonight's event, and again, this is in the chat, is also be available on our CSSH YouTube channel, and you can find that link in the chat. Yes, Jasper didn't know we had a CSSH YouTube channel. We do, check it out. So again, thank you everybody for being with us. I'm just so amazed by the really original and innovative and important work that our students are doing. And also, I don't know, I want to say something about the seriousness and respect with which we all listen to each other and question each other. It's really a wonderful community to have spent some time with. So thank you again, everybody. And I will leave it to Gabby to actually shut us off.
Thank you, everybody. Take care. Be well.